Today we're on the River Welland at Stamford. There is a large meadow just outside the town, and the fishing's free, but it's also quite difficult. The river is quite varied. There are shallows, there are deeper stretches, and there's a lot of vegetation on the banks. There are a lot of trees overhanging the river, and in some places actually in the river. And it's not fished a lot, I don't think, but it contains some quite reasonable chub. I have quite a long association with Stamford. I've been fishing there since 2009, but long before that, when I was a young lad, probably about 8 or 9, my aunt and uncle moved to Stamford and lived there for a few years. He was a stonemason, and he was working on some of the rather beautiful stone buildings in the town. And I spent a couple of summer holidays up there off school. And I remember the river clearly, and I remember also the fishermen. There seemed to be a lot more fishermen on the river in those days. And I wanted a fishing rod, but unfortunately my wish was not granted. And it was quite a few years later before I actually started fishing. What led me to start fishing here in 2009 was we had visited the town before then and had a walk along the river and spotted a few chub. And in fact, at the footbridge, there's a footbridge at the end of the meadow which crosses over to the opposite side of the river where the footpath continues. From the footbridge we saw some really very nice chub. There was some really quite magnificent chub just near the surface and sort of just swimming in the stream, and that made me decide to come back, which I did. And after that I caught chub on every visit, bar one, when the river was in flood. And there were some nice fish. I mean, say quite a few £3 plus, quite a few £4 plus. And my personal best, in fact, of just over £5 was caught just below that footbridge, in the pool just below the footbridge. Anyway, back to today. Things didn't start too well. I left my stall at home, so you will note that I'm spending a lot of time either standing or on one knee, which wasn't very comfortable. Plus the fact that the rain that was forecast to end before I got there persisted, and I actually got quite drenched with water in my shoes due to the thick wet grass. But anyway, I set up the video, and you can see me here in the first spot, which is where about a year or so ago I caught 3 chub from this spot. So I thought this is a good place to start, and perhaps we can get some early action. But it wasn't to be, and in fact, if you want to see fish today, then I suggest you stop watching now, because in fact I didn't get any, and it's only the second blank I've ever had at Stamford, and as I mentioned earlier, the first one was when the river was in heavy flood. However, if you're interested in seeing what it's like to fish at Stamford and get a feel for the river and the type of spots I was fishing, then please carry on watching. There were a few spots I've filmed. I had to stop filming at one point because the rain was too heavy, and I'm using my iPhone, which isn't water resistant, so that sort of limited things a bit. Here I'm casting across the river into a bend where the water's a bit deeper on the far side, and there are shallows on the near side, and there are some fallen branches in the river, and I'm casting close to those. Classic chub spot, and I really half expected to get a bite fairly quickly, but despite persisting for quite a while, I'm afraid no bite was forthcoming. So I decided to move on and try the stretch literally just below this, which is like a beach, and again there's deep water on the far side. Yeah, I've actually just moved downstream a bit. I was trying a little bit further up. As you can see, my rod rest and my net are in a different position. And I'm casting down again on that far side where the water deepens and there's overhanging trees and bushes, and I've caught a lot of chub out of this spot in the past, but today absolutely nothing. But interestingly, I met a guy later in the day who was fishing, float fishing maggots, whereas I'm ledgering lumps of luncheon meat or bread flake. And he told me that he caught a 2-pound trout here that morning. He must have fished it after I fished it, and he showed me a picture, and it was at least 2 pound. I don't know if he'd actually measured it, but it was a fine fish, and I would have put it at over 2 pounds. And I didn't even know there were trout in the Wellands, so that was a bit of an interesting surprise for me. Of course, I persevered in these spots longer than the video clips tend to suggest, but watching me not catch fish is not particularly interesting, so I shortened the clips for the video. And in a moment we're just about to move on to the next spot that I tried. Here I am again casting across the river. You can see the water is quite shallow in front of me, but again it's deeper on the far side, and again there are overhanging trees, and I've placed the bait as close as I could without snagging myself to those trees. In fact, this is the one spot where I actually got a bite. I missed it, and it was a bit of a sharp jag rather than the more usual pull that the chub tend to give you. But it could have been a chub, but I missed it, so I'll never know. And that really was the only action of the day, which was really quite disappointing. I'm not sure why things were so quiet and why the fish were so unresponsive. River conditions look quite good. The only thing I would comment on is there was very little flow, and normally on this river you do get a decent flow, and also the gravelly sections were looking sort of mucky really. Often the gravel looks nice and clean, and more so obviously in the summer. Some of the weed was dying off, which could have accounted for it, and it was difficult to know really why things were so quiet. It's possible that the water quality wasn't very good with the lack of flow, and the fish were just not feeling inclined to feed. The guy I mentioned earlier who caught the trout, he was, like me, expecting to pick up a few chub and also perch, because he was float fishing maggots. But like me, other than the trout, he hadn't caught anything either. So it seems that things were, it's not just the way I was fishing. As I say, he was trotting maggots, which is an entirely different method, and he didn't get anything other than the trout, which was really quite exceptional for this river, and certainly not what he expected. Anyway, it's time to move on to the next spot, which as you will see in a moment is another challenging little opening between the bushes and the undergrowth, and yet again I'm casting to try to get under an overhanging tree and hoping that there will be a chub, or perhaps a few chub lurking there, just ready to grab my bait. But as I've already mentioned at the beginning of this video, that wasn't to be. But you need to try these things, and what I find on these sort of rivers is you go along, you try these spots, you try all the likely looking spots, and as I've mentioned in previous videos, if there's a chub there and if they're in the mood to feed, then normally you don't need to wait too long for them to make their presence known. by this point I was getting a little bit stiff and creaky, having to kneel down all the time, having forgot my stall, and I was also still very wet in places. It wouldn't have been an issue really if the fish had been cooperative, but when you're not catching fish, these things are a bit more niggling than otherwise they would be. Anyway, we're just about to move on to one more spot to have a look at, and to have a look at a different aspect of this river. This is in fact the tail end of a large bay, and it's a spot when I first fished this river that was a real favourite. I caught a lot of chub out of this swim, but I didn't fish it from where I am now. I fished it from the head of the pool, but over the years that has become completely congested with bulrush. You can see the bulrush behind me there. Well, that's what's grown at the head of the pool. So you can't actually cast. Well, you could cast, but you could never get fish in. So fishing it from the tail is not quite as effective. But it has provided a lot of fish in the past, so I thought I'd give it a go today and see what happened. I sort of cast upstream to get to the head where I would normally fish, and I also cast across stream and downstream, so I explored the swim quite well, and I tried. You can see the gravel runs, which are the favourite for the chub, and I was placing the bait in those, but yet again there was not a touch. And more worryingly, in all this walking along the river, I hadn't seen a fish. It's quite usual to spot a chub or two. Certainly earlier in the summer you can stalk them by just looking for them. But today, other than a couple of very small fish, I just didn't spot any chub. And later on, I walked up to the footbridge and there was no sign of chub there, and I tried fishing at the footbridge. Again, another favourite spot, and again, no action at all. And as a last resort, I crossed the footbridge, and strictly speaking, I think the meadow or the land on the other side of the footbridge isn't part of the free fishing. It used to belong to a club which has ceased to exist, so it's reverted to the landowner. Anyway, I went up there because there is a spot there that I've always been successful with. It's my go-to spot. If everything else fails, it's a very difficult spot to fish, and very, very difficult to get the fish in. But it's that sort of place where if you're really struggling, you can pick up a chub. Well, as you can guess, not today. Well, to finish off, we'll go to one more spot. This video is already getting a little bit too long, especially as there's no fish to see. But I thought I'd just show you this one because, again, it's a proverbial jungle. You can't really see the river from where I'm filming, but basically there are trees sort of in front of me to the left, which is a good place to drop a bait under. They overhang the water, and opposite me, sort of in the right of the picture, there's another tree overhanging the water. And again, I've caught chub here. Normally, as soon as you plop in, if there's a chub there, they take it. But fishing is not predictable, and I think today has proved that beyond doubt. I just clipped the overhanging tree there with my cast, so I'm having to cast again. Again, that's the other difficulty with these places. You want to get as close to the trees as you can, or as close to the places where the chub are hanging out. But in doing that, there's a good chance you'll lose your tackle, because if you get caught up in the tree, and then the commotion that follows, of course, if there are any chub in the vicinity, that's probably the end of it. Well, as you watch me catching nothing in the jungle, I think this is the point to draw the video to a close. Sorry there's been no fish today. I had high hopes given my track record at this venue, but I haven't fished it for a while. It was February 2019, the last time I fished here, so I perhaps lost touch with things a little bit. Rivers do change over time, and that might be the reason, but on the other hand it might be just that the fish weren't in the mood. But thank you for watching, and until the next video, bye for now.